I want to welcome you to the fourth Responsible Conduct of Research workshop series. And this one is on the IRB and ethical use of human subjects in research. And it's presented by Dr. Richard Karalus. And he has joined us before if you came to the Good Clinical Practice and did a wonderful presentation there on the IRB, though this one is slightly different, definitely. So what I want to tell you is, please feel free to ask questions as they arise. You can either unmute or place them in the chats. Dr. Karalus, you're still open and flexible about when the questions can be asked. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah. Just interrupt me because I don't always see what's on the chat. So just feel free to interrupt at any time if you have questions.
No problem. I will be monitoring the chat, so that is not a problem whatsoever. And I also want to tell you that I will be placing a survey link in the chat box at approximately 5 o'clock. Along with that will be a selection of the slides that you can also have. And then I will be also be sending the survey out twice over the course of this week. And finally, I want to remind you that next week we do not have a workshop in the series because it is the day after some people's holiday. Not for others, but for some people. So we don't have one after that, and there will be one on the eclipse, but it doesn't start until 4, so I believe that we should be fine. And then the last one will be the week after that. So no workshop next week, but then the 2 weeks after that is when we're going to finish our series. So I'm going to pass it over to our esteemed presenter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm here to talk about the IRB and ethical use of human subjects in research. And it sounds pretty easy, but I hope that I'm going to raise more questions with you than I leave you with, which is not a bad thing. So first, I wanted to just state that I don't have any disclosures, financial conflicts or anything with this series. So anyway, a lot of people think that, we all know how to do research, human research, and how to get approval and everything. And it's not necessarily the case. This is actually something that happened just before COVID. There was a Chinese scientist who claimed that he had genetically altered babies and was the first to genetically alter a baby. So this was kind of like taken by gas when we saw this come out. So, I just didn't put the whole article, but I put some of it. So, a Chinese scientist claims he has helped create the world's first genetically edited babies. In research that would be illegal if carried out in most countries, Professor He Jiankui and his team said they altered the embryos of 7 couples undergoing fertility treatment. 1 successful pregnancy resulted from this treatment and resulted in twin girls born earlier this month that the scientists claimed were naturally resistant to HIV. Scientists have lined up to criticize the research, which it turns out to be true, would represent a profound leap of science and ethics. So, there's a lot of things wrong here. So first of all, this study didn't receive any peer review. It wasn't submitted to any IRB ethics panel or anything. The scientists just went ahead and did it. And if I look at it from what we look as the ability to approve a project, I would say there were no significant benefits to the subjects. So the subjects were both the parents and the baby. So they were engineering HIV resistance into the new children, and the children weren't really at any risk for getting HIV. Neither of the parents was HIV positive. They didn't have any significant risk to get HIV. So there was no benefit to any of the subjects, whether it be the parents or not. Were there risk? Of course there were risk. Anybody who knows anything about genetically altering human cells knows that we haven't yet perfected it. We're getting better and better at it, but there are definitely significant risks. If you insert genes in the wrong places, you can cause malignancies and other difficulties, and none of this was tested or looked at. They also used subjects that would get additional protections in the United States. So they were working with pregnant mothers and fetuses, and those definitely get additional protection here in the States. They're considered vulnerable subjects. Also, improper consent. When this scientist consented the parents, he basically told them that he was doing a project on AIDS vaccine development. Nothing could have been further than the truth. And probably one of the most important things was this investigator actually had a financial interest in a company that was proposing to do genetically altered babies. So he definitely had a conflict of interest when he did this study, and that needs to be managed and announced, and probably would not have allowed him to do the study at all under his name. So, like I said, this happened in 2018, just before COVID struck, and we tend to think that we have well-managed human subjects research, but nothing could be further than the truth. Here's another case. This actually you may or may not be familiar with, but it still is having reverberations today. This is probably the most unethical research that, in my opinion, that I've seen. This was a study that was done in 1998 that linked vaccines to autism. It was done by a former Dr. Andrew Wakefield. They stripped him of his MD, and he published a link between autism and vaccination that still resonates today. When we look at the facts of the publication, he couldn't have possibly linked vaccines and autism. He did a small study with 12 individuals. Now, anybody who knows anything about side effects with vaccines, any of the side effects are mostly in the serious side effects would be, in the 1 to 100,000, 1 to 1 million or higher numbers. And we definitely know that 1 in 12 recipients of a vaccine do not get autism. How did he do this? How did he even claim to do this? Well, basically what he did was he selected 12 children that had autism, and he looked at what age they were diagnosed with autism and what age they received vaccines. That was his sole link to between vaccines and autism. And for everybody who knows, autism is diagnosed at about the time when children are getting vaccines. So a weak link, yes, very weak, and no link at all. So the data could not support his conclusion. What a lot of people also don't know is he also accepted $675,000 from a law firm that was hoping to be able to cite a study linking autism to vaccines. So he definitely had a conflict of interest when he did this study. Remember, this was 1998, so $675,000 25 years ago was a lot more than it is today. Since then, there's been over 20 scientific studies using tens of millions of vaccine recipients, and there has been no link between autism and vaccine administration. So, what does that cause us? What issues does that cause us? It's really difficult to overcome that perception. Again, it was debunked almost 15 years ago, but people just don't consider that. They don't look at the facts of the study. They don't know science enough to know that you can't do a study with 12 subjects and claim to find a link between autism and vaccination. But nonetheless, a lot of people took it further. Well, they said, vaccines have a preservative called thimerosal, and thimerosal has mercury in it. So maybe it's the mercury in the vaccines that links autism, or that is the cause of autism. It's not really the vaccine. Well, Dr. Wakefield's vaccine did not contain any thimerosal, so people don't consider that as well. And, anybody who's familiar with, today's society, there's a huge distrust in authorities and lots of conspiracy theories, and those exist to this day. So what does this do? It fuels huge resistance to vaccination today. I mean, look at COVID-19 when they came out with the vaccine. There was a significant amount of the population that wouldn't take the vaccine. Look at measles. Measles, we almost had eradicated here in the United States, and all of a sudden, due to resistance of parents to have their children vaccinated, we now have a recurrence of measles outbreaks throughout the country, whereas we were this close to having it eradicated from not only the United States, but the Western Hemisphere. Also, people don't understand the historical vaccine disease risk. Back pre-vaccination days, the age the age that people lived to was on the average of in the late 40s, 46, I believe it wasn't, when they first started coming out with vaccinations. And it wasn't because adults didn't live to the same old ages that they do now. It was actually because of the significance of childhood diseases that killed off children. About 25% of infants never made it to the age of 2. about 33% of children never made it to adolescence because they would die of childhood diseases that we now have vaccines against. So again, people don't realize that the risk of vaccination, and there are risks with vaccination, but they definitely, the benefits of being vaccinated are much higher than the risk of vaccination in this day. What also other considerations is you place others for risk. When you don't get vaccinated, all of a sudden there's a higher prevalence of disease around. So, you know, measles, for example, like I said, we had it eradicated from the United States pretty much. And now all of a sudden, well, if you're vulnerable to measles for whatever reason, you may be immunocompromised or even decided not to get the vaccine or other reasons due to illness. Well, now it's around more and you have a higher chance of getting it. Also, herd immunity. We can't achieve herd immunity unless we have a high percentage of people that are vaccinated. Herd immunity is how we get to eradicating diseases. Like I said, when you get the measles vaccine isn't 100% effective, nor is any other vaccine. They're on the order of, maybe 80 to, 95% effective, depending upon the vaccine. So the people who get the vaccine who don't respond to the vaccine may still get the disease. And even though they wanted to be immune, since other people choose not to get the vaccine, there's a higher prevalence of the disease out there that they can now get. So they're kind of at a disadvantage, even though they wanted the disease, because of other people's resistance to getting the vaccine. So those are some of the issues that we have to put up with when unethical studies are done like that. So ethics, what is the definition of ethics? The definition out of the dictionary is the discipline of dealing with what is good and bad and with moral duty and obligation. And that sounds pretty easy. Most of us, I would assume, think that we're pretty ethical people. We know what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, but sometimes it's not all that simple. So I kind of put the question out there, what is ethical? Consideration of what is good, what's bad, what's acceptable. Is that intrinsic? I guess we would all like to think that it's intrinsic, but for example, people know that it's wrong to kill your fellow man. Well, what about in a time of war? What happens if another country were to invade us and you were put into the army? Is it now unethical for you to kill, or is it not? I'm not going to even answer that, but I just put that forward to think about, because it definitely is a thinking point. Ethics is also based on your experience, personal experience, the experiences that we have, what we each individually consider good and bad, also what society considers good and bad. I think we're all old enough to, see that our society has gone through a lot of changes in the last decade. I would say not much for the best, but things that were considered not acceptable 10 years ago are now considered acceptable. And that's just a fact of life. Our peers will also, we talk with our peers and we'll decide based on our peers what we consider ethical and what's not ethical. Leaders, I'm not even going to go into leadership here. That's our leaders have changed over the years, and what's considered ethical now is definitely different than what was considered ethical 10, 15 years ago. Time period, again, that's another thing. Things that were considered ethical now may not have been considered ethical way back when in other time periods. We look at our movies, even old movies have, things that now we would consider just horrible, which were considered acceptable, decades or centuries ago. So the time period also dictates what's acceptable and what's good and what's bad. Technology is also a huge driver, especially for us scientists, because we need to consider new technologies and how they fit in with what's ethical. Like I said, 20 years ago, genetically altering a fetus would have been considered incomprehensible. We never would have been able to do it successfully, and we really didn't feel it was ethical to even try. But now the technology is sort of getting there, and we may be able to do it, albeit we still do have issues with that. So different technologies will drive our ethics. So why is ethics important? So basically, I'll go through a number of reasons. First of all, it satisfies the need for fairness and honesty. Everybody loves fairness and honesty. Also helps develop trust. That's important. When you're a physician or a researcher, you need to get the trust of the public that you're working with. creates credibility for yourself. We trust that, Dr. So-and-so is going to do what's right and avoid doing what's wrong. Also helps your reputation. It improves your decision making when it comes to difficult decisions. It helps us to accomplish long-term goals by setting proper ethics, what we want to accomplish. And it unites people with a common goal. So those are some good reasons why we consider ethics important. So research ethics, I'll kind of change a little bit gears and go towards our research ethics. How should we look at our research projects and apply ethics to it? And this is a changing field, so beware of that. Consideration of our research topics. What research topics are considered acceptable versus what are not acceptable. Eugenics, 75, 100 years ago, eugenics was considered an acceptable research topic. Today, we wouldn't even think of studying eugenics. And beneficial, or at least not harmful. Is our research topic going to provide benefits or at least not harm other individuals? So that's another consideration you want to take when you're choosing a research topic. Research methods, also, that's important. We may be able to develop the next cure for cancer, but if we're going to end up killing 90% of our research subjects or maiming them, then, well, it may not be worth developing that cure. So the research methods are going to dictate what we can do ethically to get our accomplishments done. Data integrity, this is a huge one. I'm always faced with, I'm also the research integrity officer for the university. So I deal with things like plagiarism, fabrication of data, and you can see the huge repercussions when somebody doesn't provide good data. Whenever we provide our data, whenever we present it or write it up, we always want to choose the best data that we have on experiments and such, and kind of ignore what doesn't go quite the way we want it to. And that's okay to some degree. If you get 99% of your research results support your hypothesis and you have one experiment that didn't quite go the way you wanted it to, then yeah, you can probably ignore that and say that was, due to some reason. If you can come up with a reason, that's great. Or just say, what, for an unknown reason, that one, we can ignore that when we've done it 10 other times and the data really does support our hypothesis. But there are people out there who will take and cherry pick their data and only pick the best data that they have that really isn't representative of all the experiments that they're doing. And that's unfair to not only themselves, but also to others, because we build our research based on other people's results. And it's important to provide accurate data and results because others are going to read that and almost consider it factual when they're putting together their research experiments. So the more bad data that we have out there, it actually hinders our work rather than helps it along. So it's very important that when you're presenting your data, that your data is accurate and supports your hypothesis, and not just putting it out there because you need funding or want to be known to be making huge accomplishments in the field. Then research ethics also, to share or not to share. A lot of times there's personal gain. If you develop a new drug or a treatment, you may want to make some money off it, and that's fine. But when do you want to share your information? If it's the next cure for cancer and it's going to take you 10 years to get a patent and you're withholding that information from all these persons who have cancer, well, maybe you could forego a little bit of personal gain to help those persons. There's also societal benefits of sharing your information. It helps the field go further down the road faster, and we all benefit from that. So these are some of the items that you need to pay attention to when you're doing your research. Now I'm going to kind of switch gears and talk about another reason why to be ethical in our work, and that's because of regulations. OHARP, Office of Human Research Protections Program, which is the one who regulates all human subjects research, has really been cracking down on human subjects studies. They've started about 20 or 25 years ago because we as a country were really getting lax with the research that we were doing. And I'll give a couple of the first examples where they really were giving us the shot across the bow really hard. So the first example is Duke University Medical Center, one of the biggest research hospitals in the country and in the world. So basically, this began with just a random site visit. OHARP does random site visits. They don't do a lot of them, but they came to Duke University. Like I said, it's one of the bigger research hospitals, and maybe they had the reasons, and maybe it was a truly random visit. But when they came, they found some serious deficiencies with their studies. And OHARP, when they come, or when any auditing agency comes, they usually give you the opportunity to put a corrective action plan in place and fix those. If they're really, really serious, they may shut down your research. But in most cases, they give you the opportunity to put a corrective action plan and execute it and fix that. And then they'll come back and check it. So they came back after 6 months, and they saw basically no response, just a couple of meetings here and there, minutes, but no corrective action plan, and definitely no action. And they were basically flabbergasted by this. So they kind of suspected that this was going around in American research. And what they did was basically they shut down Duke's federally funded research. So Duke had thousands of studies, probably tens of thousands of human subjects. And they basically came in and shut down the entire research until Duke came up with a corrective action plan. OHARP's director basically characterized Duke's failure as a failure in leadership. Nobody took them seriously, just thought it would go away by itself. So OHARP knew we had a problem with research regulations. So what did they do? They went up to the biggest research hospital in the nation, Johns Hopkins, 2 years later. They had a report of a research subject. Her name was Ellen Rose. She was a healthy 24-year-old who volunteered to take place in an asthma study. And basically, the asthma study used a drug called hexamethonium, and a subject would inhale it, and it was supposed to induce a mild asthma attack, and then they would study the asthma attack. However, within 1 day, the subject had lost about a third of her lung capacity and ended up in intensive care in the hospital and died within a month. So when OHARP looked into this, what they found was that the PI limited his research to basically one contemporary textbook, and he looked at PubMed for any known side effects of hexamethonium. Well, hexamethonium was a drug that they hadn't used since the 1950s. This was 2001 when this took place, and PubMed, unlike now, only went back about 10 or 15 years with their research. So all of the side effects that were published for the drugs were published way back in the 1950s and 60s and wasn't in PubMed. And Dr. Tagayas basically did not go any farther back than what PubMed had stated in one textbook, and never found that hexamethonium was discontinued from use because it had serious side effects. So OHARP again came and suspended all the 2,400 studies at Johns Hopkins with 15,000 human subjects, and basically put their entire research program on hold until they came up with a corrective action plan. One professor at George Washington School of Medicine said this is just laziness. What happened is not just an indictment of one researcher, but of a system. The IRB reviewed this at Johns Hopkins, reviewed this study, and also should have caught up on the risk of hexamethonium. And obviously, the IRB did not do its job by catching this either. So again, these were the two biggest research institutions in the world and in the country on human subjects research, and OHARP came and shut them down. So this was a shot across the bow for every university and institution doing research in the United States to basically shape up, including the University at Buffalo, who looked at their program and found it woefully non-compliant. All right, so now I'm going to change gears again and go on the history of compliance with human subjects research. So human subjects research actually goes back way farther than what I'm going to cover, but I'm going to basically start at about World War II. This is kind of what we would kind of consider the modern field, albeit it may go back to about the 1920s or something like that, but we won't cover that We're going to start at kind of the worst of the worst. And that was German and Japanese experiments during World War II. So they did some nasty experiments in both Germany and Japan around the time of World War II. They did bone and muscle and nerve transplantation studies. And, if you're looking at the period in the 1930s and 40s, the technology did not exist to do those types of studies. They did nasty head injury studies where they would give, humans head injuries and then attempt to treat them. Freezing experiments where they would basically just freeze a person's limbs solid. This was done on prisoners and such. Malaria experiments. They would intentionally infect people with malaria, infection with all types of pathogens, mustard gas, and other chemical warfare agents, sulfonamide, chemical warfare agents. They injected seawater directly into people. They tested phosphorus burns, blood coagulation studies, using just atrocious methods. Now, the one thing I might point out is, remember, this was World War II, so their rationale for it wasn't just torturing people. Their rationale for this was, if you look at it, in dealing with the war, a lot of those studies were done so that they could better treat their injured in the war. Also, malaria and pathogen infections were another item that a lot of armies had to deal with. So they did those types of things. Seawater, you look at, why would you inject seawater? Well, one of the reasons why they looked at seawater was because saline, which was used with a lot of the injury, was difficult to carry around on a battlefield. They had the glass jars back then, and it was difficult to transport and difficult to manage on a battlefield. So a lot of the Japanese battles were fought on islands and seawater was plentiful. So they thought, well, saline is kind of just salt water. So maybe if we take seawater and dilute it to the right concentration, maybe we could just inject seawater and substitute it for saline. Obviously, that doesn't work, but nonetheless, those were kind of the rationale for the experiment. So a lot of people may look at these as totally atrocious, and the methods they used were totally atrocious. But the reason why they did those studies was actually they had a reason. That was their ethical reason. We're trying to save our soldiers on the battlefield and our civilians in the cities that are getting bombed. So that was kind of their ethics. Very, very weak, but nonetheless, that was kind of their ethical thought on it. So after the war ended and we became aware of all these nasty experiments, the Nuremberg Code was put into place in 1947 to kind of deal with ongoing studies with human subjects. So the Nuremberg Code was actually a very good document. I'll go through the major points of it. And basically, the Nuremberg Code stated that if you're going to do human subjects research, that voluntary consent is essential. You can't use prisoners or people who aren't volunteering for studies. It has to be totally voluntary, and you must consent those persons before doing any study. Also, the research has to have scientific merit for the good of society. Seems to make perfect sense. Experiments should be based on results of animal experiments and knowledge of disease. You can't move directly into human beings in doing your experiments if you can use animals to do those experiments. You need to do research on animals and prove that your treatment is safe and effective on animals before you ever touch a human being, if that's possible. That also gives you knowledge of the disease when you move into humans. Experiments should also avoid unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. Again, it seems commonplace, but the German and Japanese experiments didn't even take that into account. No experiment should be conducted if there is reason to believe that death or disabling injury may occur. Again, another common sense point that the Germans and Japanese did not adhere to. And the degree of risk should never exceed the importance of the problem to be solved. So we need to make sure that the risk is relative to the benefits that we might encounter. Proper preparation and adequate facilities should be available to protect subjects from injury, disability, and death. If you're going to do a medical experiment, well, you should have a hospital or a clinic nearby to treat somebody if they need it. It can't be done just anywhere in a laboratory. Experiments should only be conducted by scientifically qualified persons. You can't have a scientist doing medical experiments if they don't understand the treatment of medicine, or they may need to have somebody on their study that does know medicine if they wish to do those experiments. The human subject has the right to discontinue participation at any time during the experiment. Seems perfectly common sense again. And the scientist has the obligation to discontinue the experiment if it's likely to result in injury, disability, or death. Again, another common sense thing that the German and Japanese scientists weren't doing. So this all sounds great. This sounds perfect. You know, we can all do our research according to the Nuremberg Code, and everything going from there is going to be great here in the United States. Well, here in the United States, I'm going to give you some post-Nuremberg experiments that took place in the United States that shows that our system may not have quite been working. So 1946, John Charles Cutler from Johns Hopkins University used prostitutes to infect prisoners, insane asylum patients, and soldiers with syphilis to test penicillin in Guatemala. When asked why he did it in Guatemala, he responded that he would not be allowed to do it in the U.S. Interesting. 1946 through 1953, the Atomic Energy Commission fed 73 mentally disabled children Quaker oats containing radioisotopes so they could study how radioisotopes were digested and stored or removed from the body. The children were told that they were simply joining a science club. 1953, in the U.S. Army, soldiers were exposed to sulfur mustard and nerve agents, basically chemical warfare agents. They weren't volunteers. They weren't even informed of the test. They were just basically put in a chamber and exposed to different levels of these agents. 1963 through 66, Saul Krugman from New York University infected mentally disabled children with viral hepatitis at Willowbrook State Hospital, told the parents that he was giving them vaccinations. 1963 to 73, Carl Heller and Joseph Hamilton irradiated the testes of prisoners to determine the effects of radiation on testicular function. Hamilton even stated that in one of his experiments had a little bit of the Buchenwald touch to it. So they knew they were doing wrong, but nonetheless moved forward anyway. Same thing, 1965-66, Albert Kligman performed dermatological studies on prisoners with dioxin during the Vietnam War when we were using Agent Orange. He was quoted as saying, when he saw the prisoners, all I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. No concern for the prisoners, for the people he was doing the test on. So how could this happen? You know, we had all these rules in effect, and why were our American scientists, who were supposedly ethically above the Germans and Japanese at the time, why were they doing these experiments? Well, again, they just thought they were ethically above the German scientists. They didn't need to follow those Nuremberg protocols. These experiments were important experiments and needed to be done, and there was going to be some risk, but they felt that the benefits outweighed the risk, and they were using persons who were prisoners and institutionalized, and figured that they could get away with doing it because these people owed society. So again, we realized that our system wasn't working. The coup de grace studies, may have heard of this one, is the U.S. Public Health Service Tuskegee syphilis study. Went from 1932 to 1972, a 40-year study. So the goal of this study was actually in 1932 was basically to study the natural history of syphilis and to justify a treatment program for Black persons. In 1932, you have to remember, syphilis was more endemic among the Black population. And there was no cure for syphilis at the time. However, subsequently we developed antibiotics and began to be able to treat syphilis and cure syphilis. So what did they do? They didn't have any informed consent for this study, even when they began and throughout the whole study. Researchers told the men that they were being treated for bad blood, didn't explain what bad blood was. The crowd they used was actually Black persons from rural communities down south who had very little education and did not understand at all what syphilis was. Some of them didn't even realize that they had syphilis. The men were promised to receive free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance for their participation in the study. The original study was projected to last about 6 months and went on for 40 years. Like I said, after we developed antibiotics that could easily cure syphilis. So when treatment became available in 1947, they could have taken all the subjects and basically given them antibiotics and cured them, and they chose not to. The subjects were never given the choice to quit the study. This study went on and on until in 1972, Associated Press published a story, and it raised public outcry on our U.S. Research program. So at this point, the U.S. knew we had a problem, and they convened a committee, the Belmont Committee, to come up with some recommendations for regulations that would regulate human subjects research in the United States. And what they published was basically the Belmont Report in 1979. And this is what our current regulations are still based on, is the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report has three pillars to it. The first is respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And I'll go through each one of these, but basically respect for persons is providing people with information in a comprehensible way, voluntariness for that person, and also privacy for a person. Beneficence is basically the assessment of risk versus benefits. We always want to make sure that the benefits outweigh the risk of a study, or at least there isn't more risk than there is benefit in a study. And also the minimization of risk. If we can reduce the risk of a study, then we're obligated to do so. And then justice. Justice has to do with the selection of subjects. I talked about the syphilis study, where they intentionally chose persons who didn't have a high level of education and didn't understand what they were what study they were participating in. So I'll go through each of these three pillars, because we still use these today to govern our human subjects research. So respect for persons. This is an important pillar. Basically, information, full disclosure to potential subjects. Need to give a description and goals of what your study is. Give procedures of the study. Alternatives. If you're proposing, say, a cancer treatment, you need to provide the alternatives. Okay, if you're not in my study, these are the standard treatments that are out there right now that you can have without being in the study. Any conflicts of interest. Like I said, a lot of times when we're doing drug studies, maybe getting paid for them, or may have an interest in a company or something. Those are conflicts of interest. Those need to be stated so that people know that, hey, the person who's recruiting me actually has an active, financial interest in the study. Any cost to the subject. There's always cost to a subject. People may say, oh, this is, the study is, there's no cost to the subject, but it may be as simple as the time that they're dedicating towards your study. It could be things like parking. If you're doing a study downtown, parking, you're not covering it. That may be a cost to a subject, but those need to be covered. Comprehension, layman's terms. I always get a kick out of, you watch old movies with doctors, and when they're talking to their patients, they are talking basically Latin and, what is Greek to the patients. They use huge terms that patients can't understand. It makes them sound intelligent, but in reality, the patient doesn't understand a word that the doctor is saying. We can't do that anymore. It needs to be in layman's terms. It needs to be in terms that the subject will understand. Also, comprehension has to be a two-way discussion. You can't just hand somebody a consent form. Here, read this and sign it if you agree to be in the study. If they have questions, they need to be able to ask somebody questions on those, and make sure that they are totally clear on what they're signing up for before they ever sign a consent form. Consent is not just handing somebody a consent document and having them sign it. A consent is considered a consent process. Here's your consent form. Go home and read it. And if you have questions, come back and we'll discuss those questions before you ever sign your consent form. That's the consent process. There may be some periods where you might have to do consent quicker. If it's something like a stroke study where you're getting subjects that are rolling into the emergency room, you may not have that much time, but nonetheless, you need to do as good a job as you possibly can with consent and comprehension for any study. Voluntariness. Also, no penalties if one opts out. If you're a treating physician, and you're recruiting from your own patients, the patients need to know that if they opt out, you're still going to give them the same quality of treatment as if for subjects who enrolled in the treatment. Recruitment also can't be coercive, so subjects need to participate for the good of the study. And there's a lot of different coercions that are out there, and I'll get into that a little bit in the consent process a bit later. Then privacy. Privacy is not the same as confidentiality. Confidentiality has to do more with records. Privacy has to do with a person's privacy. So basically things like public health information can't be made public. And discussions on the study or on the subject's condition need to take place in a private room or a private area. So I kind of use the example I'll use for privacy is if you're running an HIV study, you can't go into your clinic and in the waiting room and say, hey, Mr. Smith, I know you have HIV. I have a study that you might be interested in front of a whole host of people. That would violate a person's privacy. So that's kind of the example I use on privacy. Confidentiality, like I said, has to do with records. Records are a different area where we do consider important, but it's not the same as privacy. The next pillar is beneficence. Beneficence is basically has to do with a number of things. First, the assessment of risks and benefits. The benefits of a study always need to outweigh the risk, or at least equal them in some studies. You can't perform a study if there are more risks than there are potential benefits in the study. And there are two types of benefits. There are benefits to the individual subject who's in the study. So for example, if you're doing a cancer study and you're testing a new drug, well, the individual may benefit by being cured or have a better treatment to cancer than what's out there right now. And then there are benefits to society. I'm doing a study on drug addiction, and I want to know what drives people to drug use, where you're just kind of doing a survey and gathering information. So there may be no benefit to the individual who fills out the survey, but once you collect enough information, you might be able to provide additional guidance on preventing drug use or something like that, where the benefit is more to society rather than the individual who participates in your study. Talked about minimization of risk, and this is really important. When you perform a study, you always are going to have controls in the study. So if you're testing a new drug, you basically want to know how it works on the disease or condition that you're testing. Well, what that means is, say you're doing a cancer study, you have a new cancer drug, you want to have controls because you want to know how well your drug is doing against people who aren't getting your drug. So with your controls, you can't just leave them as untreated subjects. That would be unethical. What you need to make sure they get is what's considered the standard of care in the hospital. So that's what any cancer patient would step into the clinic. You would treat them with the approved drugs that are out there. That is the least treatment that you can give subjects in your study. They have to be able to receive the standard of care. And then the subjects who sign up for your study who get your experimental drug would be compared to those subjects. So basically your drug needs to meet what's the standard of care to be effective or better than the standard of care. You can't just use untreated persons as your control group. Also need to minimize your risk by doing animal testing before you ever touch a human being. The IRB is going to look into this. FDA is going to look into this. They're going to want to see huge mounds of data with studies done on animals and the best animal model that you can find before they're ever going to allow you to go into human studies. Also consideration, we talked about this a little bit, individual subject sensitivities. If you're dealing with something like illegal drug use or diseases that have stigmas to them, need to be considerate about those and have precautions to minimize the risk. For example, if your job is at risk because of illegal drug use, you sign up for a study, they wouldn't want to let your employer know that you're an illegal drug user, and you could potentially get fired for that. So you need to have consideration of sensitivities to the subject that you're studying. Justice, the last pillar. So this is selection of subjects. This seems pretty basic. Subjects should be the benefactors of the work. So what that means is basically, say I was doing I had a new treatment for cosmetic surgery, and I wanted to get subjects to participate to see if it's effective, if it's safe. But the treatment cost may be $20,000 or $100,000, and it's not going to be covered by insurance. So you couldn't go out and get subjects who couldn't afford that treatment and have them be in your study just because, yeah, I'm going to pay you $1,000 to be in this study, or even $5,000 to be in this study. You would get a lot of persons with of a lower economic status who would never be able to afford your treatment, but yet they would be undertaking the risk for the treatment, basically being coerced with $5,000. So you can't do that. You need to make sure that the subjects who would be in your study are going to be the benefactors of your treatment. Also, again, going along with that, subjects should not bear the burden without the possibility of the benefits. Kind of goes along with the same point. Again, the subjects who are in your study should be the benefactors of the research that you're performing. All right, so now I'm going to kind of shift gears again. I'm going to go towards the IRB. The IRB stands for Institutional Review Board, and that's the United States way or committee that's involved in approving research. And UB has our own IRB, as does every other institution that does human subjects research. So we'll kind of go on what the IRB looks like when you submit your study for review, and how to get your study approved. So the first question I usually get, and I get this a lot, almost probably a couple of times a week, is, does my study need to be submitted to the IRB? Because there are some studies that may be considered not human subjects research and may not need to be submitted to the IRB. And somebody will give me a brief description of what their study is and expect me to give them a full determination. My answer is always going to be, if you have that question, if you don't know that it's not human subjects research, you should be submitting it to the IRB for review and approval. And that goes even beyond if you know your subject is, if your study is not human subjects research. There's a lot more journals out there, and also conferences. They're going to ask you if your study has been reviewed by the IRB before they'll even allow you to give a presentation or publish that research, regardless of whether they know it's not human subjects research. Because believe it or not, the regulations, even though they're out there as federal regulations, there are additional regulations, be they state regulations. New York, surprise, surprise, has additional regulations beyond the federal regulations, which add to our review, differing than other states. And also sometimes institutions will have requirements as well. So the bottom line is different IRBs will give different determinations. In New York State, our exempt determinations are a little bit tougher than other states just because of New York State law that requires us to do so. But nonetheless, if we find that you've done research, so say you go and do something that you felt was not human subjects research and didn't need IRB approval, you go along to publish it, and your journal says, we need a letter from your IRB that states that this was not human subjects research, and you were 99% sure that it was not human subjects research. The IRB can come along and review it and say, and confirm your finding, yes, this was not human subjects research, and furnish you with a letter. But the IRB may review it and say, oops, this was human subjects research according to our guidelines. And now all of a sudden you've done research without IRB approval. That's serious non-compliance. That not only will not allow you to publish your work, it's also reportable to the federal government as research without approval. And you run the risk of doing that if you're not absolutely positively sure that your work is not human subjects research. So always it is a good thing to go to the IRB and get approval. For most cases, when you think your research is going to be either exempt or not human subjects research, the application is pretty easy. We have a huge study protocol. It's called the 503R. It's something like 30 pages of questions, and people complain, I've got to fill out this whole thing for, research that I know is not human subjects research, or that I know is going to be exempt. Well, most of those questions are going to be not applicable, and you can simply put not applicable in there, and the IRB will review it and give you your determination, and then you're free to go and do your study. And when it comes time to publish it, you won't have any issues in publication or any risk of serious non-compliance that's reportable to the government. So, like I said, if you're asking me that question, my answer, and anybody in the IRBs, is going to be, you should submit it for a formal determination. I can't give you the answer over the phone, and I won't give you the answer over the phone based on just a few facts that you provide to me. I'm always going to send you to either a consultation with the clinical research office if it's biomedical, or the social and behavioral office if it's a social behavioral study, and they can more closely look at it and determine, yes, this should be submitted, or no, this is truly human subjects research, once they have all the information on the study. All right, so this is a list of all the regulations that we need, the IRB here at UB needs to follow. So we need to follow CFR 46, that's the Health and Human Services, commonly known as the common rule. That is basically governs almost all of our research. If you're doing a study with a new drug or device that you want to get approved for treatment, the FDA joins the fray, and the FDA regulations are slightly different than the Health and Human Services regulations. So you may have to do things slightly different if you have a study that's covered by the FDA. Like I said, New York State has our state laws, mainly the mental health and hygiene laws that we need to deal with in New York State, which puts us at a little bit of a higher bar than most other states when we're reviewing our research, especially the exempt research. HIPAA laws sometimes come into effect. Local laws, we don't have any local laws. We're an accredited, AHRP accredited IRB, so the AHRP puts us at a slightly higher standard than other IRBs. Our FWA, which is our assurance to OHRP, gives us regulations. We do have some institutional requirements that we have, and then many times sponsors who are sponsoring your research may have additional requirements, and those are all the requirements that our IRB needs to consider when they're looking at your study. So it's a huge burden. It's not very simple. Excuse me. So the types of IRB determinations you can get. You can get a not human subjects research determination. So the IRB reviews your study and looks and they find that they consider it not human subjects research. You're now free to go do your study, and you don't need to worry about any of the regulations. Excuse me. The next higher level is an exempt study. These are minimal risk studies, and I'll talk about minimal risk a little bit later. And there's 8 categories that UB can use. Different institutions throughout the country, there's a list of categories you can use, and it's based on location. So if you have a study, there's also the single IRB rule where different IRBs can cede review to another IRB. So if you're doing a multi-site study, usually one institution will become the IRB for all the sites. When it comes to exempt work, based on location and based on institutional setup and organizations, there are different exempt criteria. So there are very few IRBs that will review for another institution when you're looking for an exempt determination. Almost all the institutions will say, go back to your own IRB, and they'll provide the exempt determination for you. So again, there are 8 categories we can use, but I believe there are 14 categories that the federal regulations say you can use. That's exempt studies. Exempt studies are the least of studies that are considered human subjects research. So when you get an exempt determination, you don't owe anything more to the IRB. You don't have to do a continuing review. The only thing you would have to do is maybe submit a modification if you feel your modification is going to bump it up one level of determination in the expedited category. But aside from that, you're still considered human subjects research. You still have to abide by the regulations, but your duty to the IRB is done for all intensive purposes. Expedited review is the next category. Expedited review is also minimal risk, but there are some risks. Mainly those would be risks to confidentiality, privacy, things of that nature. Those first 3 categories, not human subjects research, exempt studies, and expedited review, can be done by an individual IRB administrator in our office without having to go to a full committee review. The next category is full committee review, and those are the more than minimal risk studies. Those are the studies mainly like drug and device studies, or where there's risks to health and safety. Those go to the full committee. We have 4 monthly meetings, and they will go to one of those meetings where you'll have 7 members review and discuss your study, and most of the time they'll give you suggestions or requirements before they'll approve your study, and then they approve it as more than minimal risk. So both the expedited reviews and the full committee reviews, those require at least annual continuing review. So at the end of you'll get a 1-year approval period, and then you submit a continuing review. And the continuing review basically gives information on how the study went for that year, any risks that you've seen, how many subjects you've got in the study, and additional details like that. And that needs to be submitted every year. And I might add that every year when you go up for continuing review, your full study is going to be reviewed. They're not just going to basically rubber stamp it and say, okay, you've had no issues, no safety issues or anything like that. Therefore, we're going to give you approval for another year. The IRB, both the committee and the administrators in the office, are going to go through your entire study again, everything, all of your documents, because they do miss things from year to year. They do miss things, and may ask for additional changes in your study based on what they see. So don't expect just to get a rubber stamp when you submit a continuing review. It is a full review of your study. So I talked about minimal risk. What does minimal risk mean for an IRB definition? And the definition of minimal risk in an IRB study is that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research is not greater than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examination or test. So that's the definition that we use for minimal risk. And that's important because a lot of people, they kind of argue and say, oh, this is a minimal risk study, but they don't really understand what minimal risk is. Yeah, there may not be any health and safety risk to it, but there may be risk to, say, confidentiality, liability, financial standing, or things like that. So employability, reputation, stigmas, those are all things that we consider when we talk about minimal risk. So it's not just, okay, we're doing a survey, on illegal drug use. There's no risk to the subject because all he's doing is answering questions. Well, yeah, well, if that information got out that he was participating in that study on illegal drug use, well, all of a sudden, well, maybe he has a job where illegal drug use doesn't allow him to be employed. He could get fired. There's a stigma involved with your friends. All of a sudden, holy cow, we didn't know that he's an illegal drug user. So there's a lot of information that comes out when we talk about minimal risk that goes beyond just health and safety. So, be aware of what the IRB considers minimal risk versus what you might consider minimal risk when you're putting your study together. So I'll talk about some specifics on what we're going to look for. Recruitment is the first topic that we give a good review to. And recruitment, provide adequate information. Recruitment is different than consent. Recruitment are things like how you're trying to get people into your study. You're putting out ads in the paper or on the radio or posting flyers or things like that. That's what's considered recruitment. It's not consent. It's just getting people interested in your study. So first, you have to provide adequate information on your study. You need to specify that your study is research. We get so much pushback from investigators. They'll put up a research flyer and they won't use the word research anywhere because they're afraid that that's going to scare off potential subjects. And that's misleading. If you're doing research, you're doing research, and that is part of the federal regulations. If you're doing a research study, it has to plainly be stated that it is a research study on your recruitment information, also in your consent. Also need to provide contact information. If somebody has questions on your study before they want to sign up, they need to be able to call somebody and be able to ask questions about your study before they ever even get to the consent process. Also, not coercive. We see this so much. Studies have large print, the dollars we're going to pay you for being in your study. And then in the small print way down below, there's a little asterisk with print that you need to put on a magnifying glass to be able to read that lists the risks of the studies. Those need to be listed with equal both font and you can't exaggerate one and minimize the other. Also, the target population. You need to be careful you're targeting the right population. We kind of talked about justice, so we need to make sure that who you're targeting fits in with your study subject. Where you're putting your flyers. You can't put flyers in an area where paying somebody $100 means a whole lot more than if you put it, in an economically disadvantaged area versus, an area where your subjects actually would, or where your subjects who would benefit would come from the study. So we're going to pay attention to that. There may be some HIPAA issues. If you're doing a medical study, you're looking into people's personal health information, you may have some HIPAA issues that you may need to deal with also. So the consent process, I talked about this a little bit earlier. We'll talk about this in great detail because this is really important. You need to, again, provide adequate information on your consent form. Describe it in layman's terms. You need to describe all your procedures. You also need to include the procedures that the subject may not be involved in. When you collect data from them or when you collect a specimen, what are you doing with that data or what that specimen behind once the subject leaves? You need to describe what you're doing on that end. You also need to plainly describe the risks. And there are risks for all studies, whether it be a survey study or anything, there's always risk, confidentiality risk, privacy risk, things like that, all the way up to, serious medical risk. Cannot overstate the benefits. A lot of people want to put, one of the benefits is you're going to earn $400 for the study. Compensation is never considered a benefit for a study. People should be doing a study for the benefit of research, not for the benefit of making money. Also, again, need to describe any alternatives. If you're doing a treatment or a new treatment or something of that nature, you need to describe what's available out there if you're not part of the study. If you are keeping data or specimens for future research, you need to state that in your protocol and state, how long you're going to keep that data for, what you're going to use it for. Same thing with the specimens that you might keep. That all has to be listed if you're keeping it beyond after the study ends. Also need to describe the consent process in your study. Where are you going to do consent? Is it going to be in a private room? Is it going to be out in the waiting room? That might be okay for certain studies. You need to describe who's going to be answering questions. It should be probably the principal investigator or somebody knowledgeable enough to answer the questions. You don't want to have just the person who's handing out your consent form. If they're just a administrator who knows nothing about the study, they should not be the ones who are answering questions. It has to be somebody who's involved with the study and knowledgeable about the study. And also how long you're going to give people to decide. I talked about that. For certain studies, they may have weeks to decide. If it's a drug study, you can give them the consent form and say, I come back in 2 weeks after you become thoroughly familiar with it, and we'll come and describe and we'll talk about the questions and you can consent. Other ones may be emergent situations. If you're studying heart attack victims and your proposed treatment needs to happen within hours of an initial heart attack, well, the consent process may be a quick one in the emergency room, or it may be with a legally authorized representative rather than the subject themselves if they're incapacitated and can't consent for themselves. And how long to decide may be minutes instead of hours or days or weeks. Consent process, I also kind of elucidated to this. There are vulnerable populations where you're going to use what's known as an LAR, a legally authorized representative. That's a person who's providing consent for you when you can't provide it yourself. And that would be cases where you would need a legally authorized representative would be in cases with children, prisoners, if people who are cognitively impaired. And there also is an assent process that goes along with some of those subjects. So with children, prisoners, or people who are moderately cognitively impaired, in addition to an LAR providing consent, you may also need to get assent from those subjects as well. You can't just get consent from the legally authorized representative and the child says, no, I don't want to be in this study. I don't want to be in this study. Even if the parent who is legally authorized representative wants their child to be in that study, if the child doesn't assent, then you can't enroll that person in the subject. And that goes for a number of vulnerable subjects. So be aware that you may not only have a consent process where there's a legally authorized representative, but there will also be an assent process for the actual subject that might be needed. Injury compensation, that's also something that you need to describe in your study. These are more for the more than minimal risk studies where, somebody could get injured. If your cancer treatment doesn't work, well, you may get cancer quicker than somebody else. Are you going to compensate somebody for that? Or if they get injured due to side effects from your drug, are you going to compensate them for injuries? In many cases, if it's a drug sponsor, they do have funds that will compensate people for injuries related to the study. But, if it's a researcher here at the university, you may not have any money to provide for compensation. And that's okay, as long as you plainly state that to a research subject. Hey, I'm testing a drug. I think it has, promise based on, past studies, but you know what? I don't know the side effects. And you know what? If you get injured by it, I don't have any money to compensate for you. Person may say, you know what? I'm still going to enroll in it. Others may say, no, you know what? I'm not going to enroll in it at all. Injury compensation or any kind of compensation, the one thing that does not provide you, even if you state you have no money, somebody can still litigate against you. So don't think that just because I have no money for it, somebody still can't sue you for injuries. That's always on the table, and you can't put that in a consent form that, I don't know the risk of it, so you can't sue me. You can never do that for a study. And any cost to subject, like I said, there may be cost to subject, could be parking, could be just their time. You need to state that in consent form. All right, so some guidance on putting together a protocol if you've never done that. Provide as much detail as possible. The IRB is not going to review and give you approval until they are totally clear on what you're doing. So if you don't provide good detail, they're going to go back and forth with you until they have the detail that they need to give you approval. So you might as well provide it up front. Don't do just a quick cursory application and expect it to get approved quickly. The IRB is basically going to give it right back to you and tell you to put more detail. Again, adequately describe the risks. There are always risks in a study. It could be just be your time. It could be risk of confidentiality, privacy, but even in a minimal risk study, there are risks. It's called minimal risk because the risks are minimal. They're not serious, but there are always risks to a study. If you're enrolling vulnerable subjects, children, cognitively impaired, pregnant women, or prisoners, which are the official vulnerable subjects, then you need to provide additional protection to those subjects, and that'll be in the study. Will provide you with information on protecting those. Again, I alluded to that you can answer many of the questions on our protocol as not applicable. But again, are they truly not applicable? When they're asking you for risk on a minimal risk study, people will say, well, it's minimal risk. There are no risks. No, again, like I stated, there are risks. They're just minimal risks. So when you're answering the question, beware, is it truly not applicable, or would you like it to be not applicable? Those are two different things. Again, if you need consent waivers, if you're need a waiver of consent because the people you're enrolling are stroke patients and they're rolling in and they're unconscious, then you're going to have to get a waiver of consent and deal with with a legally authorized representative for consent. Make sure you have that in there. If you're dealing with if you expect to encounter non-English speakers, we talked about justice. You can't exclude non-English speakers because, I don't have a Spanish consent form. That's unfair to people who don't speak English. You need to either provide a justification for not using non-English speakers. And the justification could be, it's a minimal risk study. There's no benefits to anybody, so I'm not going to enroll them. One justification is not, I don't have the money to get my study consent translated. That's not a good justification for not using non-English speakers if you expect to encounter them. And then again, HIPAA waivers. If you're doing your recruitment and you want to go into the public health or personal health information, the electronic records, patient databases to find subjects, you may need to get a HIPAA waiver to go in there and look for potential subjects. So don't forget that if you're doing medical research. So non-compliance, I'll talk a bit about serious non-compliance. We get maybe 2 or 3 serious non-compliance issues a year, maybe even a little bit more than that. And I'll talk about some of the common items where we see serious non-compliance. It's a pretty high bar to have serious non-compliance, and you would think people would understand it, but there are some common areas where we see serious non-compliance. So the first one, and these are the ones that we commonly see, performing study with unapproved methods. It sounds kind of common sense. Well, I'm going to get my methods approved by the IRB, and that's what I'm going to do. Well, a lot of people go and they get their methods approved, and then all of a sudden they realize, well, my methods don't work quite as I wrote them. You have people in the office, I can't do this method. Therefore, I'm just going to change it a little bit. It's not going to affect, the study at all. And I have the subject here. Well, that's serious noncompliance. That method, even as minor a change as you think it is, was not approved by the IRB. You just committed serious noncompliance. So, if you realize that you can't do your methods to achieve your study goals, well, you need to submit a modification to the IRB and get those methods approved before you do them on a study subject. The only exception to that would be if changing the method is in the interest of immediate safety and welfare of the study subject. You need to change your subject. You need to change your method because somebody's health is at risk. That would be the only time when we would allow you to change your methods without getting IRB approval. And then after you change your method, you would need to submit a reportable new information submission and a modification to the IRB and alert them that you changed your method. Performing research without approval seems pretty basic again, too. Nobody's going to do research without approval. Well, you know what? I just submitted my study to the IRB, and they said that my study is about to be approved. But you know what? There's one person on the study who hasn't done their training or hasn't done their conflict of interest disclosure. Aside from that, the study's ready to be approved. Well, that person isn't involved till later in the study. Therefore, since they said it was approvable, I'm going to start the research because I have a subject coming in tomorrow, and I don't want to have to bring them in a second time. And the IRB told me that my study is ready to be approvable. Well, you know what? If your research is done on a date before you get the approval letter, the official approval letter from the IRB, you just did research without approval. That is serious noncompliance. Again, I talked a little bit about improperly excluding or including non-English speakers. You'd be surprised. Well, I enrolled this person. I didn't have a consent form translated. But I enrolled them. I didn't have any methods in my study to enroll them. But they fit the criteria really well. And you know what? Their relatives spoke, a mix of English and kind of translated for them. Well, you know what? You can't do that. That's considered serious noncompliance. And also excluding them. If you know you're going to be performing a study and, a majority or you expect to encounter a person speaking a different language, well, then you should be prepared to include those people in the study, have translated consent forms or have translators available for those persons because you're going to encounter them. Protocol deviations. Again, like I said, study visits outside the approved time frame. We see this commonly as serious noncompliance. You know what? A person went on vacation. They had a study visit scheduled during vacation, and you know what? They're coming back, and I said we were going to have a study visit 2 weeks outside of once they complete a certain step in my study. You know what? It's 2 days after because they were on vacation. I'm going to just bring them in 2 days after, 16 days rather than 14 days. That's not allowed. That's protocol deviation. That's serious noncompliance. You can change your if your time frame doesn't work, you know what? I put a 2-week window in, but you know what? Most people can't make that 2-week window. We need to do it a month. As long as it fits in with your study goals and everything, you can make a modification and change that, and then you're compliant. But you can't do it without getting that approved first. Enrolling ineligible subjects, another thing we see. If you put eligibility criteria in your study, then that is the eligibility criteria that you use for your study. You're not allowed to, this person's one value is off by just a little bit. We enrolled them in the study, and anyway, because it was off so minor, it's not going to have an effect. Well, that's serious noncompliance also. Unapproved personnel working on the study. You have somebody, a doctor you want to add to your study, you need to submit a modification, and the IRB needs to approve those. We can get those approved in a day or two. But you know what, this person's ready to go and they're qualified and they're going to get approved. But so I'm going to have them do work on my study because they have a patient that's coming in. Nope, can't do that. Improper consent process. Again, another item. If you're not sitting down with your subjects and doing a proper consent that was approved, again, serious noncompliance. Those are the common items that we see for serious noncompliance. So I'm going to give you a study that we got, case presentation. And this is back in 2016. I got this study that was sent to the IRB. An investigator proposed a study to determine if a new pain control regimen was effective. The study design proposed to compare two groups of individuals who had just undergone a painful surgical procedures. The test subjects would receive the novel pain medication, and the control group would receive no pain medication. They wanted to basically see whether their treatment alleviated pain or not. So I'm going to kind of put this out to the group and ask, is basically on what I talked about, is this study approvable as it's described, and why or why not? All right. Well, hopefully everybody has had a
Hold
chance.
on, we have some chat.
Okay.
Hold on. Okay, so they are saying the study would not be approvable as the control group should receive at least standard of care. And then not pain control should be provided for the control subjects as well. And this doesn't seem to have been measured by animals first, though I'm not sure it could be.
Those are all correct. I didn't have the animal one on, but I did have the standard of care. And I don't believe they did any animal studies on this before they moved to humans. So this study was actually disapproved. The IRB almost never disapproves studies. Maybe once a year, once every other year, we would disapprove a study. But this was a case where we disapproved this study and said, don't even send this back the way it's written, because we will never approve it. All right, very good. So now I'm going to go through some brief case presentations just to show you what people propose and the types of research that IRBs around the country are presented with. The first one is actually, it's a malaria project, and this was a U.S. project, and I'll give you a little bit of background, and we'll go through it and kind of discuss it. So the goal of this study, this was a real study, was to develop and test an effective treatment or a prophylactic by infecting humans with malaria. So the background of this was, at the time this was proposed, there was no effective treatment. Only human tests were planned for this study. They didn't want to do any animal research. And the subjects they were using to be infected with malaria and then test the treatments or prophylactic agents were patients that had tertiary syphilis with cognitive defects, mentally ill persons, or prisoners. So I'll go through this because it's kind of common sense. Does this sound approvable? And the answer is absolutely not. When we use our Belmont principles, there are things that would, catch my eye right away where, they only did tests with humans. They didn't do any animal work. The subjects to be infected are people who I would consider vulnerable populations. They're picking tertiary syphilis patients with cognitive defects. They're picking the mentally ill and prisoners. It's like, that's horrible. That's kind of like the worst subject pool, that you could think of when you apply the Belmont principles. Well, I'll give you a little bit more information on this study. Again, this was a real study that took place. So again, the goal was to develop an effective treatment and prophylactic. This was done just prior to or at the beginning of World War II. And the background reason for it was malaria was expected to be endemic in many of the areas where U.S. troops would be deployed. And malaria is a huge issue with armies in the field. When you go into these areas without any treatment or prophylaxis, you get a huge amount of cases of malaria. Germany, who we were expected to go to war to, had already developed a prophylactic agent, but they protected the manufacturing process. So we weren't quite at war yet. We could still get the agent, but obviously if we went against Germany in the war, which we expected to do, we weren't going to be able to get the prophylactic agent. So we would both be fighting on the same battlefields where malaria was endemic, and our enemy Germany would have a prophylactic agent and we wouldn't. So we would basically have a huge number of cases of troops that came down with malaria. And for every soldier that comes down with malaria, it's a huge strain on logistics. It takes an average of 2 soldiers to care for it. So you're taking 3 people out of the field for every malaria patient. And the German army who we expected, or the Japanese army who we expected to fight, wouldn't have the same strain on logistics. Again, there was no effective treatment at the time. And the next thing I'm going to state is there's no good animal model at the time for testing malaria. So that was the reason why they decided to go straight for humans. Now, they did take their chemicals that they were testing and test them for safety on animals before they injected them into humans, but they did not have a good animal model that looked like malaria in humans. So any of the animal experiments that they did would not have been of any value in testing with humans. So that's why, those are the reasons why they went straight to humans, and that was why they proposed doing the study in the way they did. So the subjects, you still have, look at the subjects. Well, geez, they're still using subjects that are very questionable, vulnerable populations. My God, why are they picking syphilis patients, mentally ill, and prisoners? And I'll give you a little bit more background on that. So, first of all, winning the war and losing the war justified the higher risk of this study, and it would be a huge benefit also to mankind if we came up with a treatment or a prophylactic agent. So they looked at it that way too. Now, for picking the subjects, what it was noted was that high fever often cured syphilitic patients because the pathogen that caused syphilis couldn't deal with high temperatures. So when people were getting high fevers, in the range of 104 to 105, many syphilitic patients, and remember I talked about the Tuskegee study, they didn't have a treatment for syphilis at the time. So these tertiary syphilis patients were going to die of syphilis at this time. There's no question about it. They were going to die. So this was, if they gave them a high fever, which malaria caused, many syphilitic patients would be cured. And it was shown that the syphilitic patients who got malaria also showed some improvement to their neurological issues. So that was the reason why they chose tertiary syphilitics. There was actually a potential benefit to those patients. They were going to die from tertiary syphilis because there was no cure. So this offered them the chance of, even if the treatments didn't work, perhaps the being infected by malaria, if they survived that, they would be cured of syphilis as well. Then the next thing that they kind of went through was, well, if high fever could treat neurological sequelae of syphilis patients, maybe it might also offer some benefit to mentally ill patients. So that's why they included mentally ill patients in the study, because they thought that they could perhaps have some benefits to mentally ill as well. And therefore, there was benefits. Prisoners, actually, this was World War II. They weren't allowed to serve in the armed forces. So there were actually patriotic prisoners who wanted to, contribute to the war effort. And this was considered a way that they could contribute to the war effort. Again, at that time, they considered subjects such as these, mentally ill prisoners and tertiary patients, owed society, because society was, in many cases taking care of them or treating them for free. We don't agree with that now, but again, those were the ethics behind this project. And this project actually did go ahead. So you can kind of see how they added some justifications and looked at risk versus benefits on this study. So, this is how the IRB looks at studies. It's benefits, risk versus benefits. And again, sometimes those risks and benefits are different based on the circumstances of the study. All right, so this is another case here at the university, and I'm going to kind of go through this case study really quickly. We're starting to run low on time. I don't want to keep you extra if I don't have to, but this actually is a true thing that happened here. So I got a call on this. A UB art student posted 17 white only and black only signs at elevators, benches, water fountains, and restrooms as part of an art project to provoke conversation. And when this happened, UB police got all kinds of calls from people who were distressed and worried about this. And then I got a call in the research office because when they contacted the student, he said, "Oh, this is a research project aimed at, raising racial awareness." So I got a call from, the vice president for research at the university saying, "Did the IRB approve this project? My God, how did they do this?" And I said, I looked into the studies and thank God there was no study in there. But the student later said that it actually was not a social research project and they didn't get IRB, or they didn't even apply for IRB approval. So they obviously made them take the signs down. But we're going to kind of go look at this as if it was submitted for research as a research project and kind of talk about it. Is this doable or not? So we use the Belmont principles to look at this if it was a study. So respect for persons. Did the research subjects have the ability to choose or not to choose to be in this study? No, these signs were put out in the public. Nobody was made aware of this as being a research study or anything like this. So doesn't fit voluntariness. Could we have made it voluntary? Yeah, there might have been a way we could have done this study. So you couldn't have done this study without consenting with consenting patients. If you told them this was a research study, well, then you wouldn't get the same reaction as if you didn't do it. So you could consent them after they were in the study, but you would have to have some severe controls on how you would consent them. You'd have to make them aware of, they'd have to encounter the signs. And then as soon as they encounter the signs, you'd have to bring them aside and say, okay, this was a research study to raise racial awareness, and get, tell them that it was a study, and, give them the risk and benefit. So it could be done, but there would have to be benefits. And we'll talk about that. Information. Were research subjects provided information on the study? Obviously not. Comprehension, again, did the research subjects understand the purpose of the study? It was never given to them. There was no plan of talking with them after they were in the quote study. And so the answer to that is no. Privacy. Obviously, this was in a public area. There was no privacy at all. Again, we'll talk about ways that this study maybe could have been done, but it was, as it was done, it was not. Okay, sorry. Beneficent. So systematic assessment of risk and benefits. Were the benefits and risk of the study identified? No, this was not proposed as a study, so there were no risks of the study. There could have been huge, risks. There could have been, racial difficulties with people, do the benefits outweigh the risk? There really were no benefits for the study. Raising racial awareness. Well, I think there's a lot of racial awareness out there. There was no benefit to raising it more by putting these signs out there. So there definitely were no benefits to this quote study. And minimization of risk. We talked about all the risks there are to this. You could have had a riot out there. People could have gotten injured. Were there measures put in place to minimize these risks? Obviously not. This was done out in a public area, in many public areas, and there was no security, additional security, or any measures put in place to minimize risk. Justice, selection of subjects. Would the research subjects benefit from the project? Who are the research subjects? It's just people out in the public. You're not really picking who they are. It's random. Would they unjustly bear the burden? Perhaps they would. Perhaps Black persons would have been subject to burdens on this. They obviously would have. Even a white supremacist may have been subject to it. If he said, yeah, this is the way it should be, and all of a sudden people started, to attack him, well, he's at a disadvantage there. So there's risk to him as well. So again, I kind of put it out there. The question, it's pretty clear, but is this research project approvable? And the answer is, I'm not even going to put it to the public because it is not. Now, could you have done this research subject? Or if you wanted to, the answer is maybe. I doubt it, but maybe. So you could have done a subject like this, where maybe you put these signs in a narrow hallway. Say you use the water fountains down in the picture, and you only allowed people, one at a time to go through and see that. And then you stopped them at the other end of the hallway, and then told them, hey, this was a research study. Could you give us some thoughts on this? Did this raise your, racial awareness, did this upset you, and things of that nature. And then they had the choice of being in the study and answering your questions, and you kind of give them a debrief and let them know that this was just a research study. So you could have done it, that way. You could have had additional security there to, to help if there was any rioting or anything like that, any attacks or things like that. But again, the risk for this study would most likely far outweigh any justification for benefits. I don't think this study with any measures would have been approvable here at UB.
Thank you. Excellent. Do you, they have the slides. Is there something to continue with, or do you think we can open it up to questions?
We can open it up to questions. Basically, what I was going to do is go through some slides on proposed studies, and you can go through those. Because again, we still don't have it perfect. I have a list of studies that I consider modern day studies that were carelessly taken on and not properly approved that people went through. You can go through them. Some of them are pretty amazing. A human head transplant was proposed. You can look at the background of this and the ethics on it and talk about it. During the COVID pandemic, there was a serious discussion on rights with the vaccine, individual rights versus societal rights, to mask or not to mask, to vaccinate or not vaccinate, the safety of healthcare workers who had to treat people who decided not to become vaccinated or put themselves at risk. vaccine choice, the risk versus benefits. There are risks with vaccines, but nonetheless, does the benefit to society supersede the individual risks? The economy, keeping the economy open versus shutting it down to control the epidemic. Is that, what are the ethics involved with that? Who was to blame for the pandemic? Is this something that just happened? Were the people who didn't control it in the first place, were they to blame for it? Were the people at the end who didn't control it, were they to blame? Was anybody to blame? Was it just a natural occurrence that we had to deal with? So those are all kind of the ethics that were under discussion and are still under discussion today. So I'll just kind of summarize it here. So again, I hope I raised more questions than I answered to get you to think about ethics in research. And the important things are: consider risks versus benefits. Know your limits, what you can do with your research and what you can't do. Again, if you have a noble goal, but you don't have the tools and the risk to do that, to accomplish your noble goal, are higher than the benefits, then you obviously can't do that study. That goes along with feasibility. Social impact of your research project, take that into consideration. Any financial concerns, conflicts of interest. There are many people who propose studies and have conflicts of interest. Not bad to have a financial interest or with your study. Everybody wants to do well, but we need to manage that. Need to state that, or maybe you're not involved with the study, or somebody else do the study because you're biased. So take that into consideration. And then there are even some environmental consequences with your study. I won't get into that. It's not as much with medical type studies, but there may be environmental impacts in your studies. So take all of those into consideration when you perform a study. And like I said, just give it some thought, and also talk with other people who aren't involved with your study. If you're confused, if you're not quite sure you're doing it ethically right, well, give it to somebody who has no involvement in your study and ask them, and they'll give you an honest answer, not the answer you want to hear. And it may not be the answer you want to hear. The IRB does that, from time to time. They may not give you the answer you want to hear, but, use that experience from other persons to perform ethical research. All right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, like I said, this is just kind of, more of a summary, and we'll go through questions if anybody has any questions. And at the end, I also have a list of resources that you can call if you have questions on your research.